And lastly, we have as a panelist is Amy Stuart Wells.
Thank you. Thank you all for inviting me here, and kind of a busy week with lots of reports coming out, but around these issues. So it's very exciting that we're re-engaging on issues of segregation again. So my work really builds on Richard's work and Kim's work to kind of talk about what this looks like at different levels of the system and how we can think about policies that could address it. So I have a policy brief that I published in December with the National Education Policy Center on diverse housing and diverse schools, trying to kind of think about what we know historically, where we are today, and how we could move forward. So I hope that's going to help. And I apologize for my non-creative slides today, but it's been a busy week already. So, so basically the NEPIC brief, which is in your packets, available online, kind of goes through a bunch of research on this housing school nexus. And I think there's several key points that we look at, including the nature of the nexus and the impact of efforts to address it, segregation either through school policy or housing policy, and then this connection really building on Kim's excellent work on this perception of place and implicit biases as it relates to this process of resegregation that we're really starting to understand from good social science research. So rather than just document how segregated things are, we're starting to look at the processes by which it happens again and again, and where we might want to intervene. So just to go over the nature of the housing school nexus, just to highlight that there's a lot of things cited in this brief, a lot of footnotes, but that we know that it's mutually reinforcing. There's a dual directional relationship between housing and schools. And I like the example that I have in the brief where I cite the Swan decision, which was 1971, when the Supreme Court, in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg case, when the Supreme Court pointed to the fact that citing schools in certain areas would lead to more housing segregation. 3 years later, when we had a very different Supreme Court in the Milliken decision in the Detroit interdistrict plan, the Supreme Court ruled that unfortunately, because the housing was so segregated, there was nothing the schools could do about it. So if you think about that nexus between housing and schools and the way it's been perceived and the causality and the flow, it's been looked at in different directions, but clearly there's a back and forth. There's a mutual causal impact, right? So the other thing to note is that it varies by region and race. So this relates to the Swan decision versus the Milliken decision. So countywide school districts, the larger school districts in the South, have less segregated schools and more segregated housing when you compare the two. And that we know that in the North, it's the reverse with the fragmented school districts. So you're going to see more segregated schools and possibly less segregated housing. But the two are very strongly related. But there are differences across regions that relate to both the history of school desegregation, the size of school districts, and population. And then black students are the most segregated in both housing and schools. Harms of segregation for both housing and schools are well documented in the brief as well. There's reams of research on this, why concentrated poor schools are problematic, and then how this segregation in housing leads to this downward spiral in communities in terms of lower property values in the non-white communities, even when you hold constant the quality of the housing, and we've done some really important research looking at that. When you hold the quality of the housing, the size of the lots, everything that you would think would go into property values, when you hold that constant and look at property values across racially distinct neighborhoods and school districts, you see that similar houses in districts with more African American students have lower property values than houses in districts with more white students. So this mutually reinforcing relationship is powerful and pernicious, and if we're going to address it, we need to be very systematic and thoughtful about that. So the other thing to think about is public policy has mattered. I mean, Richard pointed out a very important history of the way in which the federal government systematically created housing segregation, and I can't wait to use his book in my class where we talk about this. But then this argument about whether efforts to change segregation levels in public schools or to integrate housing has any impact in either direction. And I say, despite Coleman's argument that white flight was created because of school desegregation, which has systematically been disputed in the literature because there was certainly a lot of white flight from New York City where we never had any systematic school desegregation. So despite Coleman's argument, we actually see quite the opposite in several places where school desegregation often helped to sever the relationship between housing and schools. So places where this research has been done, like Louisville, Kentucky, we see that again, these larger countywide school desegregation plans where families that lived in diverse neighborhoods could send their kids to their neighborhood schools. So it was only if you lived in a segregated neighborhood that your child participated in a busing or a forced reassignment plan. Those kinds of plans help to support diverse communities and diverse housing. So there are instances where we see school desegregation having a positive impact on housing segregation. We've also seen that housing integration plans of various kinds, including housing voucher plans, moving to opportunity, can have a positive impact on racial makeup of schools. So this is not a problem that we can't address through public policy. We created the problem through public policy, and we should address it. So one of the things that we've been looking at in our research on Long Island and then drawing from other work, Kim's excellent work in Pennsylvania, leads us to really think about these issues of perception of place, as Kim pointed out, and these issues of implicit bias, which has become more popularly recognized now that we've had these issues of police brutality in the news, and the really powerful body of work that has not yet been applied to the housing literature in the way that I think it should be. So if we know implicit bias is this relatively unconscious and relatively automatic features of prejudice judgment that often affect social behavior. So perception of place, perception of a community, perception of a school and the quality of a school can be biased based on the racial makeup of the school and the community, as I mentioned before. When we control for the quality of the housing in segregated black communities, the property values decrease, even though the housing's the same. So there's something going on in terms of perception, understanding of place. So we know that white home buyers devalue houses and schools and communities that are becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, even when there are no tangible differences between those places and others with more white residents. So this is how this process of resegregation begins to play out. So why is this a good time to really focus on this, other than the fact that there seems to be media attention on the fact that we have racial segregation once again, as if we haven't for the last 30 years. So I'm excited that we're paying more attention to it, but there's something else going on that's very important in terms of the timing and the need to address this. So it's something I've been calling metro migrations. Others have called it the great inversion, the changing demographics of suburbs and cities. And those are also supported by very powerful federal, state, and local policies, more related to housing than to schools, right? So the new construction, the enterprise zones going back to the Clinton, Bush II era, that started the gentrification process in the cities that's now on steroids in places like New York, particularly Brooklyn and Harlem. The push for greater home ownership that led to the mortgage lending crisis in the suburbs helped support the movement of more lower income families out to inner ring suburbs, in particular, places we've studied on Long Island. Okay, so you have these federal policies that really supported this changing perception of place and ability of people to live in cities or suburbs. So we are seeing demographic changes happening quickly in both contexts. And patterns of segregation reemerging in both contexts. You're seeing white flight now from many inner ring, second ring suburbs, right? As you're seeing cities gentrify and low-income people of color being pushed out and displaced, not only out of communities, but out of public schools as well, which is something we're studying right now in Brooklyn. This is a comic, but it's not funny, but it really gives the overview of this history. So the fact that whites lived in the cities prior to the Great Migration and the changing immigration laws of the mid-20th century. Minorities move into the cities. Whites flee to the suburbs. Whites move to second-ring suburbs as we start to see more changing inner-ring suburbs. Minorities are moving. Whites move back into the cities. So it's this process, this kind of almost choreographed dance of segregation that we're seeing play out in several metro areas. So the question is, how can we address it? So the consequences of these metro migrations will either create spaces for more diverse cities and suburbs, which is the optimistic view, or it can lead to highly segregated, separate, and unequal pockets in both cities and suburbs. So some of the recent research on income segregation by income as well as race is showing pockets of affluence and poverty in both suburban and urban contexts, okay? So as people are moving across these boundary lines, what could we do to sustain more diverse suburbs like the ones I've been studying, or pockets of gentrifying areas like we're looking at in Brooklyn? So we talk about this process of segregation, resegregation amid the migrations. So again, it really builds on Kim's important work about when people perceive a place and how that leads to this downward cycle, the spiraling cycle of resegregation. So if you start with the top, if you think about these intangible differences and implicit bias in the perception of what a place looks like, can lead to racial segregation, concentrated poverty, which then leads to real tangible differences across these boundary lines in terms of property values, property taxes, resources for schools. And then educators responding to accountability mandates and the pressure on these school districts that we've seen then relates to this whole kind of panic mode that occurs in these school districts and decreasing student achievement levels, and then metro migrations, changing demographics kick in again. So it's this cycle of resegregation, and we've been arguing that the place in which you can intervene and make change is in these understandings and these implicit biases about diverse communities and diverse public schools. And you have to do both. So our recommendations are that policymakers should embrace and capitalize on changing racial attitudes. We know the millennial generation is much more in favor of living in racially diverse communities and having interracial, engaging in or supporting interracial marriages. So we'll have more biracial children in this country, although we actually know we've had a lot of that historically that we haven't paid attention to. Policymakers must consider how current accountability policies in the field of education exacerbate segregation and inequality. As Kim and Annette's work has shown, when we only fixate on test scores, and test scores are correlated with race and class in ways that are complicated, and only some of us who study that culturally related relationship in terms of standardized tests would can speak to. But it's an important indicator when we're using test scores as the main measure of good schools and good communities, then we need to really broaden that definition and think more carefully about what is a good school in the 21st century. How are we preparing children? And that actually speaks to the report that we just had coming out from the Century Foundation on how racially diverse schools can benefit all students. And there's strong cognitive science research on educating children in diverse contexts can be beneficial. And thirdly, we need to address implicit bias directly, as we're talking about in the policing world around these issues of police brutality and murders that we're seeing of, and sadly having to remind us that Black lives matter in this country. And so thinking about implicit bias, how that relates to policing, we also need to think about how that relates to how we understand communities and schools, because it's clear from the research that there are biases towards communities where certain people are concentrated, and that there's a racial distinction there. So if we're not going to talk about that and be explicit about that, we're not going to be able to address it. So those are our recommendations, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. Again, you have a card, and if you could just put your question on the card, then we will have a staff to come and get it.